Are Platonic forms real? Short answer, no. Long answer, well, Platonic forms are at the root of Plato's and Socrates' philosophy, Platonism. It's one of the core pillars of their school of thought, and Socrates proposed that the forms of objects were more real than their physical counterparts. But what even are these mysterious Platonic forms in the first place? We would likely call them today something like concepts or abstractions. The simplest way to put it, a form is an idea. The idea of justice and the form of justice in modern casual conversation would be roughly equivalent. But Platonic forms are a little more distinct than the general term of idea. A Platonic form is kind of like a perfect idea, a perfect mental representation of something. Something similar to forms that might be more familiar are mathematical abstractions. Consider how in geometry, like the axioms of Euclid, they always talk about perfect lines, perfect circles. Deductions from observations about the properties of these abstractions are the bread and butter of fundamental early geometry. Socrates and Plato, with their theory of forms, are kind of trying to apply a similar tactic to philosophical, not just mathematical, reasoning. They wanted people to talk about things in abstract, conceptual ways. If you're interested in what something really is, like justice or courage or good, then you should look away from the physical world and to the mental world, according to Socrates. Reviewing individual incarnations in the physical world will only get you so far. You can talk about the myths and legends of heroes and contrast their good and evil acts, but what you are really trying to do is trying to get at the pure concepts of good and evil. According to Plato and Socrates, a better way to do this was through directly pondering over the forms themselves. Though Socrates was far more interested in figuring out these ethical abstract notions, like justice and the good, the theory of forms also applies to casual objects. For instance, we can observe casual objects in daily life, like an apple or a chair, but there's also this conceptual mental idea of what an apple or chair is. We have to compare each physical instance to these mental ideas to determine whether or not they are apples or chairs. The form of a casual object is kind of like a mental set of parameters by which we define certain things to be one thing or not. It must be something which you can sit on, might define the logical processing of what someone considers a chair, for instance. But do these concepts, these ideas, these forms, really exist? Plato and Socrates' theory of forms is the notion that these forms are more real than that which we encounter in ordinary sensory experience. This is why Plato and Socrates are often described as proto-rationalists, as rationalists like Descartes later went on to hold that through logical deduction of abstractions and not sensory experiences is how all true knowledge is obtained. Socrates believed this to be the case for all matters philosophical. He insisted that through contemplating the forms, like how mathematicians pondered over abstractions and made deductions about them, philosophers could do the same and rationalize through deductions about philosophical subjects like justice or the good. But there was a bit of an issue with this. Anyone familiar with paradoxes like Zeno's arrow or Achilles and the tortoise likely has an instinctual clue that seemingly logical deductions relating to physics, for instance, don't necessarily result in conclusions that align with reality. For example, Zeno's arrow, put in different terms for simplicity, states that in any one frame of time, if time somehow froze in place, nothing would move. Intuition seemingly says that time must be made up of a series of these frames, but no matter how many individual frames of time pass in each individual frame, each minute quanta of time, there can be no motion. The paradox comes about because, well, in practice, the arrow moves. Where does the motion occur if every frame of time is motionless? All this to say, this is an example of a series of logical deductions that doesn't really work, because it falls outside the realm of quantity. Therefore, our intuitions seem to be of less value. A possible explanation behind this is that perhaps quantity is somehow better suited naturally for deductions. Perhaps mental deductions on ratio and quantity are easier to agree upon because ratio and quantity are more universal. Or perhaps, somehow, mathematics is like a bridge between our mental deductive world and the physical, which is why it works as a language for all of science, and why all of science, when its aspects are quantified, can have its mathematical aspects be run through deductive reasoning that result in more knowledge. Yet, still, the processes of those various sciences, like physics, remain difficult to predict and don't always make intuitive sense to most human understanding. So, do Platonic forms exist or not? Deductions and intuitions through abstractions seem to work well enough for mathematical and geometrical propositions. Does this mean that those abstractions and concepts like perfect straight lines and perfect squares somehow exist above and beyond both the mental and the physical? After all, we have created the ideas perhaps, but surely we cannot be responsible for the laws and relationships between them. Humans may have invented and categorized the notion of a perfect circle, but how could we have invented the properties of those circles? Like how when a circle's perimeter is laid out straight and flat, did we somehow invent that it would always reach the length of 3.1 circles of equal size? It could be said those properties of circles just come about as ideas of their own, and some ideas related to quantity and geometry happenstance to work well in real-life instances, insofar as those instances match the abstractions. For instance, you would have to get exactly the same size circles and have a perfectly thin perimeter of the straightened circle so as to get down to the exact decimals of pi. From there, as pi is a seemingly endless irrational number, you would need to get more and more exact measurements. In other words, get closer and closer to exactly same size circles and perfectly thin perimeter lines of the straightened circle. for the measurement of the straight line to exactly equal 3.141592 and on and on and on, there would be no end to chasing perfection. You can never draw a perfect circle, because it's mathematically impossible. The divergence from the real world and the perfect abstractions of mathematical deductive reasoning form the root of a lot of issues in measurements, engineering, metrology, construction. The more important the structure being built, the more precisely down to decimals all the important measurements along the way have to be, and it's still never exact. We live in a world of estimations, best guesses, close enough. Perhaps that is exactly why Platonic forms, on an intuitive level for many people, seem to be complete pie-in-the-sky fantasies. Most common people would likely say, sure, there are abstractions that can be useful for mental deduction, specifically in mathematics, but these aren't perfect ideas above and beyond either physical or mental. No, these are kind of like heuristics, representations. And these abstractions only work in the real world insofar as the real-world instantations match those abstractions. A straightened-out circle will only equal a pi length across other same-size circles down to a certain decimal, because all real-life instances are approximations of those perfect abstractions. And applying these perfect forms to things like acts of justice, right and wrong, it seems a bit futile to attempt when each instantation of those things is often extremely distinct, wrapped in emotion, in a gradient of more or less just or good, and way more open to personal subjective interpretation than basic geometrical observations. Whether or not ideas and concepts exist or not is both uncertain and a matter of interpretation and definition. But judging by the world we live in, it's easy to see why someone might say the perfection and exactness of the forms, whether or not they exist, might not be the best way to define a world with so many imperfections and so little exactness. And as always, thanks for watching.